Uh, Good evening. This is Subhash Gatade. Welcome you all to the 43rd lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series organized by New Socialist Initiative. This is a special program as we have special guest Chandran Nair this evening. Chandran is an author, thinker, and political activist, and founder and CEO of a pan-Asian think tank, Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT. You can call him a global citizen also. He's born in Malaysia to parents who were born in Kerala in India. He has studied in UK. He did science and engineering. Then he has worked in Africa, also worked with anti-apartheid movement. And right now he's based in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur and Hong Kong. So he's effectively a global citizen. We at NSI are really thankful to him, but to Chandran for accepting our invite and join the program and share his views despite his extremely busy schedule. The theme of today's program is India, China, and the New World Order. Is the onus on India to oppose, to change and adopt? The format we have chosen for this program is little different from our regular programs. Here, Chandran will be basically in conversation with Ravi Sinha, founder member of New Socialist Initiative, a physicist who has done PhD from MIT, an author, a political activist, a name all you are familiar with. For us, Chandran was the best choice to discuss the theme, as he has a vast experience spanning more than 3 decades to study and watch the massive transformation in China and being also involved in few projects on environment in the country. His latest contribution to the ongoing debate on China is the book Understanding China, Governance, Socioeconomics and Global Influence, where he is the principal author. Here is a list of few of his other publications: Dismantling Global White Privilege, Equity for a Post-Western World, The Sustainable State, Consumptionomics. Friends, please give a big hand to Chandran and over to you, Ravi.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you, Chandran, once again for accepting our invitation. It's really true honor for us to have you here. We have all been very looking forward to this evening. Of course, the topic too, of which you are an expert, world-renowned expert, should be interesting to our participants this evening. We can say that we are living through a rare moment in history when the existing world order so we seem to be living in a rare moment in history when the world order seems to be changing right in front of our eyes, especially underlined by the recent the aggression against Iran by US Israeli combined. China has been, even before this present conflict, China has been at the center of the changing world order. It has been a major force affecting that world order. But what appears very quite clear even to the layperson's eye is that right now we see China, Russia, and now Iran, going and gaining a different kind of standing in the world compared to US, Europe, and in a different way, India too. So the topic this evening, India, China, and the changing world order, could not have come at a better time, and we couldn't have had a better guide for us than Chandran to lead us through this labyrinth of very complex, and rapidly changing scenario. But of course, our focus, we are here mostly in India, and our focus will be on India, even though India does not appear to be a major force behind the changes in the new world order, but still our concern is with India. But Chandran, can we start from the larger picture first? We can, if you can tell us first your thoughts about the way the world order is changing, what are the major changes in your opinion? And then we can move on to what role China has played in the changes and why China has been able to play such important role in the current changes in the world. Why was it in a position to do so, or how has it brought itself in a position to do so? And then towards in the third part, we can move on to India. So I will, let us welcome Chandran once again. And Chandran, we can start with the larger scenario of the changing new world order, and then move on to China.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Subhash. It's a great pleasure to be here, to speak to an esteemed organization like yours, dedicated to social justice, based in India, with an international outlook. You were very kind to call me an expert, but that's usually a very dangerous term. So I'd like to just say I've tried to bring my lived experience, which, as you said, has spanned many continents and many issues, and having lived in different parts of the world, and of course also being of Indian origin, my parents, I have been a student of development, really, and that's really where my insights, if you want to call it that, or my way of thinking about these things have been expressed, and I suppose it has resonated with quite a few people, and therefore I've spoken quite widely about some of these issues. So thank you for having me. I think one of the things that firstly we need to understand is that the world is constantly being changing. So when the people talk about a new world order, it's not as if we will wake up one day and there's a new world order. There's a constant shift. Let's be very clear. There was an old world order, which was one of the imperial colonized world, where a handful of European nations essentially dominated the world and controlled the world. Then a shift came when the countries of the developing world sought independence and then became independent as well. And that started in the 40s and the 50s, post the Second World War. And then there was a period during which there was, I suppose, broadly a period of harmony, a sort of new view that we would now create prosperity. Many countries would join in, populations grew dramatically, and although we had wars and we had challenges, we hadn't felt that we were going to be retreating backwards. So at this point, and at all during that time, people, particularly in the global majority, were seeking always a new world order, in the sense that they didn't were looking for a revolution, but they were looking for a world in which the old order, post Second World War, what was called the Bretton Woods sort of agreement, would be improved, because many countries were not involved in writing the rules of those. India was not involved, so many countries wanted to be involved, but they were not too disgruntled to the point that they were wanting to create great rifts in the world and chaos. They weren't. They were willing to apply themselves to the change and the dialogue through the established institutions of the UN and with trade, WTO, etc. Then in the last, I think, 10, 15 years, things began to change. And so my experience has been, having lived in Africa, etc., and saw, having been involved during the latter years of the liberation struggles in southern Africa, particularly during the 80s, etc., to understand that the liberation struggles were essentially also going to be part of changing the world, because most of the world saw Africa as a distant place that did not actually really matter that much. And then Africa started to have to be taken seriously, particularly once people like Nelson Mandela, etc., got global prominence. So to answer your question, I'll come to the question of then China. Um, so I've had the privilege of arriving in China at the later part of 1989 and 1990. I moved to Hong Kong. China was very poor, and I think the viewers from India will be able to relate to it. It was very poor. It was very polluted, and it was very chaotic as well. And that is only, when we look back now, was only about 35 years ago. China was, but the reforms had already started in the mid 80s. Then there was the Tiananmen Square issues, which created a lot of international pressure on China, etc. So I saw a country that I was fascinated with because, in a way, being brought up in Malaysia, Chinese weren't alien species. I was brought up with Chinese. My neighborhood, we all had Chinese friends. So as a kid, Chinese were just my friends. So it was not these strange people as people who from Europe and even sometimes India view, but I think Indians have closer proximity. And then in Africa, I met quite a lot of Chinese as well, development experts. Even China, at that time, China was poor. I recognized they were sending experts to help with the struggles of development in Africa, etc. So move forward, very fast forward. I began to see a China that was so polluted, but at the same time, I saw a structure because I was working in consulting and very much involved in what I think most of us will today understand as a nexus between economic development, which model of economic development, and therefore political economy and governance system could you use to drag over 1 billion people out of poverty, create economic well-being and mobility, but at the same time not use methods of extractive development, if we want to call it that, and destroy the country. How do you do that? So my work was very much in consulting on environmental sustainability issues. And I began to start to see that actually all of this, and when we talk about India, we can talk about this, all of this is actually about the political economy and therefore the role of the state. And I began to form a view that the state in the large developing countries of the world at this time of resource constraints and the convergence of all these existential threats, whilst having to deliver on the promise of greater economic well-being, not everyone getting rich, but the rights to a life free of drudgery is the way I put it, is such an important challenge. But at the same time, I was, particularly people like me, who had been educated in, you could say even brainwashed, in the sort of Western liberal ideas, were thinking, well, how are they going to do this? Because, it would have to be following the rules of free market capitalism, neoliberal economics, and then all that other stuff about democracy, etc. But then I started to notice something else, and I started to see how China was beginning to do that. So long story short, I saw things dramatically change over 15, 20 years. At the turn of this century, I saw China begin to take a dramatic step forward, having dealt with the real painful elements of poverty in the 90s, etc., and then started to move forward. And what was very clear to me was the sense of governance through stability. And governance by getting everybody onto the same page. And more importantly, putting the notion of collective welfare before individual rights, which is almost, as I say it, anathema to people who think in this utopian idea of democracy where everybody has a right to do everything and attain everything they want. I've come to the conclusion this is an absolute lie. So then that's how China, I think, began to change. And the results are now here for us all to see. So to the final point of your discussion about the changing world order, That changing world order in the last 15 years was essentially the rise of China. Now, then I began to wonder, why is it that mainstream Western media and also those who bought into that narrative, including people in my part of the world and dare I say India, etc., were so anti-China? I could not understand this. After all, if you looked at the world data on human progress, the indexes on human development, etc., China was the major contributor to essentially the uplifting of the human condition if you looked at all the World Bank data, etc. And I couldn't understand why everybody was so anti so many of what I was reading. Again, you are influenced by what you consume, particularly people like me who were brought up or brought up to read the Western media and think that the BBC and CNN were all oracles of truth. We all now know that's completely different. They are all just propaganda arms of the same sort of vested interests of the imperial states. And then I began to understand that the fundamental issue here was that the Chinese system was the threat to the changing world order post Second World War, which created a facade that liberal economics would change everything, would be the answer, that free markets, democracy would essentially help lift everyone, and that the model would essentially, and the architecture of the world system would still be controlled and governed by Western institutions and powerful Western nations. China was upending that, and that was the main threat. And then the attempt to demonize China became so strong that I began to understand too that there was something amiss here. And then I started to begin to connect that with essentially the need for the old powers who had given us a facade to believe that there was something about the great democratic traditions that they were espousing but never actually believed in or enforced in their empire, etc., were very worried that a new political system and reckoning would take place. Now, fast forward, and I'll finish. I hope I've answered your question. Now, if you look at the last 3-4 years, and then you look at the last 2 years, something else has happened. And I think that has been that the world has woken up to the lie. The average person who is a rational human being, looking at the actions of the United States and the European allies, I mean, if you look at Gaza and all of that, but you can even go back to the Iraq War, thought, well, there's something wrong here. These people talk about freedoms. These people talk about the need to prosper, but they are the ones who typically incite wars. They seem to, in fact, almost deliberately incite these wars, create tensions, etc. But they never seem to essentially be interested in the art of peace. There is no art, there's no peace industry, they have a war industry, and now the United States government has created a war department. I mean, it's almost, you can't make this stuff up, right? So I think what's happened is the world has, and particularly in the last 2 years with the genocide in Gaza, been shocked that the people they thought upheld all of these things and which they bought into, particularly elites from our part of the world, have suddenly woken up to something's wrong here. How can these people who have talked to us about and preached to us about freedoms, democracy, etc., not condemn the outright murder and genocide of Palestinians? And I think that has been a big shift. And I wrote a piece about 2 years ago called the time of reckoning for the West, because people around the world who looked up to the West, we were all, I mean, I speak English because I was the subject of a colony, right? It's not actually my native tongue, if you say so. So, but I'm expected to speak English if I am supposed to be on an international platform. So we all become more versatile at masquerading who we are actually, but our sentiments, our history, our connections are much more complex. But for a long time, we let that all be subservient for acceptance within the sort of world order of the existing Western system. And that, I think, is the biggest change. People are saying no more. I don't want to be involved in this. I need to find out more. and that has changed things. And I think the war in Iran, the war against Iran, has accelerated that, both in terms of people's understanding. They don't need to necessarily support the Iranian government, but they understand that you can't go and do this. And all the red lines have essentially been crossed. It's okay now to go and abduct the president of a country. It's okay to go and assassinate the president of another country, kill his family, kill all their leaders, and in fact, assassinate the religious leader of a large religious group. It's the equivalent of it's okay to go and kill the Pope. So all the red lines have gone, and I think people around the world are shocked because these red lines being crossed not by some pariah state somewhere, but not by the axis of evil, not the Koreans, the Iranians, but by the Americans and the Europeans. In this last instance, less so the Europeans. But I challenge my European friends and say, but none of you were outraged by the killing of the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. You just took it as, oh, that's one person gone. It's not nice anyway. And that's normalizing this sort of barbarity and this breaking of all the rules. So I think that has got people around the world shocked. And finally, I would say the resistance that Iran has put up has shaken the world too. And that's a longer discussion. I was in China last week with a group of 100 people from all over the world talking about what it is. And most people think it is a massive signal and a lesson for the United States. And that's why the Europeans are not going there. But it's changed everything. But it's also changed, I believe, the energy map of the world, because everything now is up for grabs in terms of So Iran has done us a great favor by actually standing up. And I think that is also part of the world order. The new world order. The final point I would say is that China in this is actually caught between a rock and a hard place when we were discussing this. So many people at one level who are, say, extremely opposed to what the United States has done, and even what the United States and the Europeans have colluded in terms of Gaza, have said, why hasn't China done anything? And it must be said very clear that China's foreign policy pillar is non-intervention in sovereign state affairs. We can support. So in this particular instance in Iran, I will just share something that was shared by Iranians, very senior people who are connected to all the discussions, that the people the Iranians trust the most are the Chinese. But I don't need to tell Indians that the relationship between Iran and India is as old as the hills. Everyone knows that. But there's also a close historical relation between China and Iran. But in the modern era, since Iran's been sanctioned for close to 40 years, and because of the sanctions and the need for energy, China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil. Someone said it's about 80%. So the Iranians really trust the Chinese. And in every part of the negotiations, China is involved behind the scenes. But China is not going to get involved in a confrontational situation with the United States, because that is not how China sees its role. So it's a tough one, and there's lots of scenarios about how China is being asked to help, but having to tread very carefully. And there are some suggestions, if the US president actually comes prepared with papers to Beijing and properly briefed, that there are some deals to be done to ease this thing. So that's how China is actually extremely influential. And China's influence is also, I think, strengthened by the fact that many countries around the world, what I call the global majority, now see China as a respectable player, even if they are threatened in some ways by China's, global footprint, etc., because they're so big. China cannot be simply seen as benign. But China has gained respect, in my view, and that's why its position is becoming critical in the New World Order. But it's not going to take a place, from what I can understand, in the New World Order like the United States and Europeans want, which is to be in charge. That is not the Chinese intention, as far as I can understand it. Thank you.
So, Chandran, if we if we stay with China uh, for a few minutes more in the larger context, how would you see what why has China been able how why and how has China been able to do what it has been able to do? For example, we hear often in our left circles that China's rise uh, was founded upon Mao's period and socialism and the revolutionary period. Then there will be others who will say that China's rise has happened only because China has adopted and adapted to capitalism. Uh, People have also argued that China is an old civilizational state. Although, I mean, I might say in your book, in the end of the second chapter of your recent book, you delicately avoid the civilizational discourse. Yeah, but people do argue that China is a civilizational state, and that has fed into strong state, keeping capital under leash. Also, China is not burdened by liberal democracy where competing political parties have to go and woo people the way they would like to be wooed. So how do you see, and I mean, how would you put an overall explanation of the miracle like rise of China, which has then fed into changing of the world order? So basically on China in the larger context, a little bit more light if you can shed.
I think several. It's in my view, and again, I want to say no one can claim to be an expert on China. I'm just giving you my understanding, having been a close observer, very close proximity to Hong Kong, and traveling all the time into China, speaking to a lot of people, and also being non-Chinese, not a Westerner, and with no biases, but actually looking at it from a point of development. So I would say it's everything that you said. It's partly that civilizational state, the doctrine of meritocracy in the system, and then it's also its institutions, freed from the curse of liberal democratic elections, all of those things for a large state to be able to think long term. And I think very importantly, also taking a very strong view, which comes back to the point I made earlier, not to get involved in geopolitical positioning that is confrontational and militarized, right? And there are those who will say that China is militarizing, etc. And I think most observers of China who are not ideologically looking to grind an axe would say it's mostly defensive posture. I think China hasn't dropped a bomb anywhere on any country for decades. Some say 50 years. There was a skirmish in Vietnam at the end phases of the Vietnam War, but that's like 50 years ago. So I think those are all the things that helped. But the most important thing I think is the political system. The political system that allowed only the best people to come through. No fools. No one like the incumbent in the White House today, or his predecessor, or before that. And I don't want to mention names because I don't like mentioning their names because it gives them credence. But but you have to be so good to be able to enter in. But a couple of other things that I noticed happened as well, and I've heard this spoken to by Chinese experts who are academics, etc. Clearly, there was a revolution, and all of that. And then there was Deng Xiaoping, who essentially said, we are going to modernize, we are going to reform, and we're going to embrace the markets, but in the Chinese way. And there are many sayings that most people can go and look. But he kind of opened up and said we would do this. And then there was, following him, there was Jiang Zemin, and then there was Hu Jintao, and now the current President Xi. Now, all of those phases in most countries will see different types of emphasis, but what you saw is a continuation of the same models of development and focus on people, and that is, I think, the difference. And I mention it in my book. Everyone who turns up in government almost carries the book and is only allowed access to the resources of government and power, having shown a huge commitment to the ideology of the party, which is to serve the people, the communitarian sort of objectives. That is very different from a multi-party state and things like that. And, you know, without annoying my Indian friend brothers and sisters, that is not the case in India. Right? So that, I think, is the glue. And then each stage, different leaders try and manage it without but because they're very capable, don't allow the system, and because the system is very strong, there are lots of checks and balances to ensure it doesn't go off track. So, but the last 12 to 15 years have been also very important. And here I'm not saying that we should only look at this period, but it's an interesting insight that I've shared, that others who are really insightful to China and I've observed, is that the current president, who extended his term by after 2 terms, as you know, is viewed in China as tough, but probably one of the greatest. And the reason is, you know, if you take from the Deng era and over the last 2 other presidential phases, other things started to happen. A lot of money, lots of things. And one of the things that started to really threaten China, going back 10, 15 years ago, was the scale of money to be made and corrupting the party and the government. And President Xi was selected as the leader who understood that this would create a catastrophic impact on the country and on everything else. So he came in and took on a very dangerous and massive task of purging of the most corrupt people. And those who are interested, you know, he took down some of the most powerful people in the Chinese system going back 10, 15, 10, 12 years ago. So that the fight against corruption was major, to the extent that, people were essentially imprisoned, and in some cases there were even capital punishment for serious. And I'm not advocating anything, I'm just saying that's what happened. But he sent a very clear signal. But the signal was also to the public, and the public, many places, some of the poor places I've been to, he's extremely popular for having, in their view, taken out those people, officials, who were corrupting the system and, in a way, further eroding the chance for the poor people to come through. And this was pretty draconian. The other things then he did, and so each stage it's different, and this is why China is in its, I think, in its deepest sort of ascendancy now. Not simply in GDP terms, because even there they've said, hey, we're not just going to chase high GDP. It's ascending in terms of a whole structural harmony. And the Chinese mantra is really harmony and stabilization, and the Chinese people would do great things. And I think that can be said for almost all countries, you know, right? You get the harmony, the stabilization, So then the big investments were in infrastructure. In the space of 25 years, China has built the largest high-speed railway network in the whole world. The United States has not even built one. It has built some of the best universities, massive amounts of investment into education, massive amount of investment into technology advancements, and then, very importantly, in eradicating extreme poverty. And I remember having a discussion 2 or 3 years ago with a friend of mine who, understands the highest levels, have some access. And I said, so what does the Chinese, and that was the time where the US was sanctioning, I think, Huawei and this and all these Chinese companies, and really was going full on. This was even before the tariffs. And I said, well, this stuff must keep the president really awake. Is this what keeps him awake? And he said to me, no. What he is most committed to is the objective he made of eradicating extreme poverty. I was surprised. That was his single most important project. And it was a complex project that there are academics, Western academics, who have studied how they did it. And you might be interested, but it went down to every household in every remote village and everywhere had a report card. And that report card had to be managed by the village head and then through the tiers of the Chinese provincial system. But to the poorest home, all of it was digitized as well. So you know how remote places in India can be. So China is the same and much bigger. Everyone. And that was the president's apparently biggest objective. So it comes back to the spirit of the type of leader, no matter what the Western media can tell you, and I'm sure he's not a perfect person, but the focus is of dedication to the community, which is very different from I need to be re-elected, so who do I go and see tonight, and who do I pay here, and who do I bring in, and whose cronies do I bring in? There is no such thing. I mean, I'm sure there is politics even in that system. But that is, I think, the success. And then finally, the lack of intervention in foreign adventures. One point I will say also was the Chinese view was for them to develop, other countries need to develop. And that's where the One Road, One Belt scheme comes in. It was an understanding that having fought imperialism, colonialism, and supported, as you know well, liberation struggles in Africa, Latin America, etc., less with troops but with advisors, medical supplies, etc. China is so very much about these countries to develop. And it is not, and yet as it is a resource-hungry country because it's so big, it wants to trade with the rest of the world. And therefore it wants to have good relations. And its view is, but if we're going to exploit these resources from these countries, then we are no better than the people we've criticized. But what we have to do is trade. And therein lies, I think, a difference too. And I'm not saying every trade is fair or whatever, because there's private interests, etc. But it is the idea that if we can develop them and help them, then they are better in terms of their ability to control their resources, grow. And if they grow, we can trade with them and we can grow mutually because they'll have things they can sell us and we can sell them, and there is trade. And I think this has also earned the trust of many, many nations. And I'm sure, and there's a lot of stuff about the debt trap, etc., but this has been debunked by some of the best economists in the world from Africa, etc., if you look at the real numbers. So I think this is what China has done and done for itself. But to your point about how has it done it internally, the focus has essentially been on uplifting people right from the base and making sure everybody has a chance. And I don't want to put these numbers right in front of everybody, but you just have to look at GDP per capita. World Bank data today, China's GDP per capita is about 13,500. I believe India is about 2008. Then you can look at the Human Development Index. And you'll know India and China were almost the same going back 60, 70 years, 60 years ago. You can look at the Human Development Index. On almost every aspect of human development, China has achieved the greatest sort of leaps forward that any country has. And it's not a country of 25 million people, it's a country with 1.3. And I think that focus has helped it to develop its own economy. Through that as well, because of its ability to develop an internal economy, it has also been able to then trade with the world, create friends, get resources it needs. And I think when I am asked to advise Chinese, I always tell the Chinese government people that your biggest threat is that because you're so big, you will trample on others inadvertently without knowing, And so I think this is advice that, it's always well received. And so that is the biggest threat. Fisheries off the east coast of Africa. I've said openly to Chinese officials, you need to really stamp this. Looking at mining in Southeast Asia, economic sort of overreach is the greatest threat, and inadvertently done by private actors, not just the state.
Okay, thanks, Chandran. So now we move to India, and I apologize to the audience that I have monopoly of Chandran for now, but soon we will turn over to the audience. But when we come to India, before I ask any specific questions, I'll just ask you to give your overall view or picture of India. How do you see things are in India? And what will be, in broad terms, your advice or your expectations or your projections? So first, your general comments, and then we will come to some specific questions.
I'm absolutely sure that I'm unqualified to give the Indian government advice, but I can share what I think it might want to consider. But as you have already suggested, these are very difficult, and let's try and draw into that, because to start, I'd say India is a political system that is essentially one inherited by its colonial masters. And therefore, you have a political system that you could argue is not even akin to what sits comfortably with what needs to be done to address the issues, the scale of the issues. But my observations, I've been going to India as well for about 30 years. Of course, being of Indian origin, my parents, there is nothing like going to India. I feel a sense of, immediately cultural, spiritual, everything. The temples, they're all close to me, and so all of those things are close. And then one has to detach oneself from the sort of emotional irrationality of saying, and which is what is the root of nationalism and religious fundamentalism, because I come from here, my parents come from here, therefore this must be right. But having basically tried to understand the world from a point of view of the rights of people to a fair chance to live away from the drudgery of life. And I saw this in Africa in the early years when I went there. Poor governance is the center of all the problems. Incompetence, and my book on the sustainable state then said, what does good governance look like in an era of a population of the world peaking at 10 billion, a mess we have created in terms of our inability to manage our use of resources properly. And I think this thing about the existential threats has gone off the agenda, but it's actually the center of geopolitics. What is geopolitics if not the control of resources? Colonialism was a geopolitical play. When they carved up Kashmir and this and that. It was all geopolitics. When they created Palestine and when they mapped out Mali with straight lines, this was all geopolitics. What was geopolitics? The, the modern day geopolitics that we are now having to live through is a consequence of the colonial era. What was the colonial era about? It was about access to resources. And at that time, it was access to resources in an empty world, but those who had access to technology, and military power could, and the Europeans were the ones who saw that with their ability to go to other lands, bully people, they were able to enrich themselves. So we all know that, and I'm not here to give a lesson on colonialism, but geopolitics is all about controlling resources. And in today's world, we have this problem of lots of people, 10 billion possibly, and we already have climate crisis. We have essentially the pollution of the land. Almost everything we depend on as human beings is threatened. But yet it's no more in the discussion. We're just talking about politics. But geopolitics is essentially fundamentally about all of that. And so when I look at India, then I think, how are 1.4 billion Indians going to have the dignity, this is where I come from, in terms of the social equity. It's not about getting rich. How do they get the dignity to live lives free of the drudgery? And I don't want to say that, as you know, and I think Indians rightly take exception to the focus on the extreme poverty that you can see in India. But the truth be told, in some parts of India, the poverty I haven't even seen in Africa. So how does a nation with some of the brightest people in the world, we all know this, they all run the IT companies in the USA and the banks and everything. How does that nation transition to what I think is the obligation of any system of governance, which is to uplift the majority from the drudgery of day-to-day life? So we spend a lot of time arguing about systems of governance, and typically the ideological geopolitical battle fight is between the so-called democracy, the facade, and then there's socialist communist people around the world who are all nasty, and I don't know what, and that's basically the argument. But what's the argument about? The argument is that apparently this thing called democracy creates better outcomes. True? I mean, that's why people argue that apparently the other system creates bad outcomes. And there's, of course, the reference to the Soviet Union, etc., but, all of those things. And my view is simply to look at which system works in terms of lifting people out of poverty and giving them the dignity to life, which is the right to food safe and secure. And I call it the 5 basic rights: food safe and secure, water and sanitation, an abode, which includes basic access to energy, education, and healthcare. Not freedom of speech. So what system would give that? And so I've looked around the world to look at these things, and I looked at China, and the Chinese system has done it. Not because I say so. You can just go and check all the data has delivered on these things. So when I look at India, I'm always thinking, well, what system would work for India that would help deliver this? Because the current system does not, sadly. And I would just say that, I want to be careful by the words I use, but I think I should say a couple of things that I hope, in the spirit of an intellectual discussion, people will understand and discuss. But I think the elites in India have been desensitized to the misery and suffering of lots of Indians. I think this is a problem. And I'm not saying everybody, but after I go to India a lot because I love it, and just everything. I don't need to say it to Indians who know I'm of Indian origin. Just I get immersed in everything and the richness and everything. But then I think, why can't they solve the problem of basic sanitation, water, and all of that? And I think it's a governance issue. And so I do think people need to really figure out what to do. So post COVID, after 5 years or 4 years, I went last year. I was invited to speak at a literary festival, etc. And I was looking for the new India because everyone talks about the new India. And what I saw was nothing's changed for the poorest. I think there are things that have become better. I don't think, I think it would be careless of me to say it. But the basic stuff had not changed for me. I felt the middle class had got better. There were more cafes, there were more shopping malls and everything. But everything else, in my view, had not really improved. And that for me was, again, comparing my experience in China, was the big difference in the time it took for China to move from things don't work to everything will work. And today things work in China to Japanese standards and better. And anyone who knows what I mean by the Japanese standards know how anal the Japanese are about standards. The Chinese have taken it up to that standard. And I just don't see that yet happening in India. And I would like to see that happen. But again, as a student of trying to look at these issues, and I looked at a smaller place from my childhood, which was Singapore, which was Lee Kuan Yew. And as you all know, that one of the first people that Deng Xiaoping, when he started the reforms, went to look and talk to was Lee Kuan Yew. And this is a place of at that time, about 4 million people, which would, fit into a little suburb in Shanghai. But he wanted to understand what the system looked like and how would you do it. And it was the attention to rigor and incorruptible officials and highly competent and no tolerance of government officials abdicating responsibility and not performing. So those are the things I noticed in India that I couldn't figure out what the next stage would look like, except to say, and I say this in a tongue-in-cheek, unless India has the Chinese system, which is tough, no nonsense, and we will do it, and we have a 25-year-old plan, and nobody has to worry about the next election cycle and who's going to come in because we have a plan. And that's my conclusion after looking at the world at large, and even in Africa, for the poor countries like Nigeria. I can't see how electoral cycles of 4 or 5 years can change anything, because you replace one, I was going to say one fool with the other, but I was going to say you replace one person with someone else who promises something they can't deliver on, and then they seek to constantly corrupt and undermine the system to stay in power. I hope
Thank
that's
you.
not too harsh.
No, I think it's that's what I mean. We understand where we have to go, and I absolutely agree with you. It's just that in India, and especially in the circles of our kinds of discussions, um, it's difficult to speak um, that what should I say, openly and honestly. There are all kinds of political constraints. Before I hand over back to Subhash, I'll just about this. One has to go through what the solve the problem, start solving the problem from where one is, and so we can't escape the political system and the society in which we live.
Yeah.
So the political system is that of liberal democracy, and society, again, if China is a civilizational state, India, in a way, if I could use, is a civilizational society. I mean, not much you can do very easily to the society. And now this combination, that liberal democracy planted in a civilizational society like India, and then all the corporate money power being as powerful as, I mean, for the Indian arena, as powerful as American corporate power is there in America. So American and the Indian corporate power can easily um, manipulate the political system, and it has also learned to manipulate the society also. I mean, India, the lot of it is big business. It's a lot of corporate money that goes into organizing kumbh. Kumbh, this
Yes, of course, of
this
course.
is, and many religious festivals. So we live in a peculiar situation. Of course,
Yes.
I agree with the problem as you state and where we have to go. Just that we find ourselves at a loss about where to start, and how, if one were to plant the seeds of a movement or towards that goal that will bear fruit in 10 or 20 years, which seeds to which seeds to drop into the soil today, if you have some thoughts about that. By that I mean, which seeds mean what kind of movements, what kind of issues can be started by progressive movements, left movements, emancipatory movements on ground, which can then carry weight, begin to carry weight with the political system as well as the social mind.
Yeah, when you talked about the woes of liberal democracy, and then you mentioned that how private interests have taken over, I was reminded of a talk I did just a few weeks ago when I said that one of the things we're seeing, and I noticed someone said India is hardly a liberal democracy, and I would tend to agree with that. But for the purpose of this, I think we would say, okay, it purports to be a liberal democracy. But the woes of liberal democracy are not just being experienced in India, and I'll come up to what I think maybe some seeds. But what has happened, and you've hit it on the nail, is that in liberal democracies, it's becoming too hard to govern anymore because the types of issues we have to deal with require 20, 15, 10-year plans that have to be budgeted for and have to be institutionalized, and all the reforms have to be made. So they become very difficult. And what we have seen, therefore, is, and I have noticed this throughout the world,
We can't hear you. Hello. Hello, can you hear us? So,
can you hear me?
yeah. Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, given the difficulties of governing in this modern era with all the threats and the expectations and the complexities, and particularly for large developing countries, but also in others, has been the rise of private interests. So, private interests have essentially thrived at the expense of the chaos or the sort of inadequacies of liberal democracies. And what has happened is governments have abdicated. And I've said this many times, and I was even once speaking at the World Economic Forum at a roundtable discussion, and I said, what I've seen is government officials sitting around the table abdicate responsibility with regard to how to provide public goods and common goods to private interests, and think CEOs know better how to do it, particularly if they're from a tech company. They must be geniuses, abdicate all responsibilities. So what has happened is private interest is essentially taken over, as you said, and the governments have sort of retreated, become weaker over time. This is a complete difference from China. And again, I'm not here to say China's got it all right, but I'm just making the comparison. If a private interest in China becomes too strong, the government will be the first to clip their wings. So, 2, 3 years ago, when the government sensed that some of the tech companies had become too strong, and particularly they were concerned about the number of games that were being created, social media, etc., overnight they asked them to take them down. Overnight. The Western media saw it as an attack on capitalism, which reinforces my point that a chaotic, weak government allows the private interests to create all sorts of goods and services, even if they're antisocial. But this is not the case in where the government is strong. And so what is happening around the world is liberal democracies are so weak, they're attracting not the best people, because nobody wants to go and serve. Whereas in China it's the complete opposite. The best people want to serve as well. And those also good people work. But if private enterprise becomes too strong and is seen as a threat to the social order, then its wings are clipped. In the US and other places, that is seen as essentially apparently an attack on private enterprise. No, here it is seen as protecting public goods. This is the same with online learning. The Chinese clipped the wings of many of these because it was seen as essentially damaging the social fabric of the school system. And in fact, just last week, I saw a very interesting announcement basically saying that they are going to clamp down on schools which are becoming businesses. Because they said a school is not a place of business, it's a place for education. So it's very interesting, all of this. So to your point, I think this is right. But in terms of trying to answer your question, what are the seeds? It's very difficult because I have argued grassroots movements can't change anything. This is unpopular, but I believe they can't. They're important, but they need allies in the state. And I think one of the problems is in our countries is the grassroots movements ape the sort of Western NGO mentality, which is, we're the good guys, you, the government, is bad, we will fight you, and hopefully we will create another spring revolution of some sort, and we will get all awards for Person of the Year by CNN and BBC, and languish in prison. And my view is actually work with the enemy you have, which is kind of what you said, work with the system. And so I think the first thing is, don't be holier than thou, but maintain what we want to achieve, and then work with the system. Because we have seen that working against the system, you will get a lot of USAID and CIA funding, but you will end up losing or being dismantled. And why would you want funding from them? So I try and advise civil society organizations in any country, please don't see your government as the enemy. This is counterintuitive to the Western sort of narrative about the civil society being the freedom fighters of the world, but they don't come and join us on the front line. So then see your government as part of your society and work with them. And I've even argued, I run a program in some countries where we call Stay and Build. Our best and brightest feel that they have to get funding from Western agencies. Secondly, they have to ape their ideas. And then they have to confront their governments. I think this is tactically not good. Not everyone in government is bad, but if you want to change the government, you have to work with it rather than, try and burn it down or something. The second thing I would say is in India, because it's so big, is actually there's no substitute for having one or two great leaders come forth at a state level, and for them to demonstrate that they are able to work with grassroots organizations, or grassroots organizations saying, this person is not perfect, but can we work with them and create a momentum? I think this is also very, very important. So I would say to all grassroots movements to not be in opposition, but to work with the devil and try tactically to improve, because otherwise the wait is very long, the price is very high, the high price of what I call entrenched opinions. And if I want the water supply somewhere to be better, to improve the lives of 5 million people. And the only way I can do this is I have to work with the state rather than see it as the enemy. And I'll give you, there are some examples of this. There's a very good example of an NGO in China. This goes back 15, 20 years ago. I know the guy who started it, who was very concerned at that time about air quality problems in China. But because air quality was being amplified by the international media as China's weakness, China doesn't care, it's a polluting nation, it was also very political. So any Chinese NGO could get a lot of funding if they wanted from joining up with all these Western institutions, etc., getting money and essentially criticizing the government. This guy went about it very differently, and he started in a small region and essentially started to build, and that was the early stages of the internet, an online monitoring system involving citizens to report on emissions, etc. And then he went to the factories and said, you need to report too because you are polluting all of this, and the citizens will join you in supporting this. It was very tactically astute because he didn't make the factories the enemy, especially the state-owned enterprises. He didn't make the state the enemy, but he knew they were the problem too. So he used technology, etc. And you know what happened? The governments, the provincial governments, all loved him because he was helping them do what they needed to do, which is to mobilize the public, to work together with the factories and help the government to collect data and start changing things. I think those are tactical issues also that are very important and change. But there's no substitute for one or two very strong leaders at the state level demonstrating. And so if you know those people, I would say to people, go and work with them and get examples, get good examples, and don't seek notoriety because you are in opposition to the government, because sometimes they can crush you. And that's not good to us because we lose the good people if they're all crushed because tactically they were not astute enough. So that's the best I can say, because I think the scale of the problem cannot, in my view, cannot be done by small organizations because the scale is big. And I would say one thing, in my book I do refer to it. People say there is no civil society in China. There is civil society. The civil society is not the same as in India. Of course, we all joke that India is probably the world capital for NGOs and civil society organizations. Every man and his cousin can form an NGO. But in China, the government basically, by the structure it has and its intolerance for wasteful disruption to plans, right? You can come and tell us, but don't be just disruptive, right? Mobilizes communities by funding them to do the work. And they have done huge amounts of work in parts that I know of, in parts of the poorest provinces where there are Muslim communities, Tibetan communities, and poor Chinese Han communities, to plant trees, clean roads, build sanitation. You can't do this by the state alone independently in the space of 15 years. So they mobilize the community, and the community is essentially a grassroots organization, but it's also politically organized around, communitarian support. So that's all I think I like to think in India, the traditions of communitarian work is still there. How does one mobilize that, but not in opposition to the holders of power who might see it as a threat, but as essentially allies. And that's not easy to do, but some of us have to swallow the bitter pill of saying, okay, let's work with the people we think are part of the problem.
Well, the kind of grassroots move.
You're not audible, Ravi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Can you? Yeah. Okay. The kind of grassroots movement environment we move around, there is hardly any question of people getting funding from outside or anything. I mean, maybe very small organizations we are more
Yeah.
familiar with. And also the kind of government we have, it is, impossible to quote unquote try to work with them. I mean, even the political parties can work with them only, or political leaders can work with them only if they join them. So it is, but anyway, that's a more practical, technical kind of discussion about the grassroots situation in India. Now, since we are moving in time, I think I will hand over back to Subhash and he can open it for the audience. I think Professor Ramana Murthy already has raised a hand and people must be getting impatient. If Yatindra can put us on a gallery view now so that Chandran can see all the participants more easily, and Subhash and Bhargav, please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So thank you very much, Chandran, for this exciting presentation. Your views, all your very thought-provoking views. And last 3 months back, we had listened to your talk with again Ronnie Chan, and then since then we have wanted to meet you online at least. So I did the discussion. We opened up for discussion, and first of all, I will ask request Professor Ramana Murthy to raise this question, and then our comrade Bhargava will then take up the questions in the chat box. Professor Ramana Murthy, please.
Ah, Thank you, Subhash. Thank you very much. Let me congratulate Chandran for giving a very insightful lecture. Since it is geopolitical, I would like to raise some issues quickly. Uh, it was an eye opener. The Iran war was an eye opener that how actually the importance of geopolitics play out, that they are eventually for controlling or maintaining the military bases and military strengths, and then to control the strategic resources for keeping the supremacy of dominant powers. This is what I finally understood about geopolitics, that this is about that. And so if the US is moving to this ultimate strategy of choking China of strategic resources because it is somewhere it is losing the supremacy. It has got only cloud technology dominance, and it has given up, all other spheres of production, where the cloud technology alone is not adequate for the US to maintain its supremacy. And military technologies and even other technologies, it is actually losing ground, and which is actually got exposed suddenly in the asymmetric war with Iran. And therefore, my question is that do you agree that there is the conflict between these two emerging powers has come to a level of an open friction, and which needs to be which should be I mean harnessed by it should be dealt by the global nations in a harmonious way, or there must be or a thinking has to emerge about how to mediate this conflict so that I mean, eventually US may have to reconcile with its weaknesses, and then it can still maintain its not dominance, but as in a multipolar world, it has to settle down. So my question is that it is US is unable to gulp the reality of multipolar world in which it has to become one of the players than the player.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. This is a subject of a lot of my discussions. The first, I'll try and respond shortly. I said it's essentially the return of hegemony. I've in fact written a piece called I call it the here now era. HERE, here now era. We've entered the here now era. H is standing for hegemony returning, and the United States, out of fear and anxiety, wants to impose its hegemony in a very big way. The E here, is basically the energy dominance, is essentially the way to retain that hegemony too and control the world, and because energy is essentially the fuel. The R is the religious and racial intolerance being leveraged by hegemons and others to create disruptions in the world. I think one would have to be in extreme denial to refute the suggestion that many of the leaders in the United States today are white supremacists, evangelical Christians who believe in essentially white supremacy and their religious beliefs as extreme and almost a crusade against, in this instance, in Iran and Palestine against Muslims, but against China. I've said this many times. I believe that the Europeans and the Americans have found it very difficult to contend with the rise of a non-Caucasian state that they have had to confront for the first time in 400 years. One has to cut this down very simply. In 400 years, the West has dominated the world. We were all subservient. And for the first time in 400 years, the West has had to confront with a non-Caucasian state. And in fact, this was in fact blurted out 2 years ago in a private discussion by one of the leading American spokespersons for the Secretary for State. So we should not be in any way surprised that a white supremacist nation cannot contend with the Chinese. It's racial, it's racist, they cannot. Then there's the hegemonic interest, but let's not forget that imperial hegemonic interest and colonization was essentially perpetuated by demeaning the other, the African, the Indian, as subhuman, that not good enough, the religious beliefs, pagans, etc. And this is essentially how colonization, etc., was justified, and people lived with it. So to your point, I think the United States will find it very difficult, will continue to cause problems until it runs out of the ability to cause problems. And I think it's coming to the limits of its power, as you have pointed out. It will not. It has two weapons today, which, as you know, is the military power that has been exposed by the Iranian war. The ability of asymmetric wars actors to engage now with technology in ways that you can't push your weight around. And it should be remembered that the United States has engaged in wars continuously for its history, but in the last, even 50 years, it's not won a single war. It's actually been defeated. Most places it's gone to. So military power is no more respected. And once others do not fear you, you can't continue to threaten. But I believe it will continue to cause problems. And the second is, of course, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which has allowed the US to punish everybody and anybody else. And that too, I think, is coming to an end, as we saw with India buying Russian oils or Russian oil without using the US dollar. So the US will have to contend, but we will continue to have to put up with the pain. The question is of their decline and their acceptance that they have to live with others, not as subservient, but as equals at least. That will take time, and I'll finish by saying the period of time over which this happens will depend on one thing. Does the United States have the ability in its political system to elect a wise leader? And I believe that the United States and the world is in such a mess today because the United States has not been able to elect a leader who was able to see what the world would look like and therefore change the narrative at home that we are not number one and put it in a way that is politically acceptable. And so for 40, 50 years, they have had no good leader. Yet the rest of us still paid sort of homage because they were Americans. But if you look at all of them, they were all very weak. A wise leader in the United States would have, over the last 40 years, prepared America for the rise of China, prepared America for the rise of Asia, India, prepared Americans for the understanding that the exorbitant privilege is not something they can continue to abuse. prepared America for understanding that might is not right, and prepared America for understanding that they can't go around the world killing people, which they have done. And there's a recent publication by the Lancet. You all know the medical journal that looked at a lot of data. And over the last 30, 40 years of sanctions in the Middle East, the United States has been responsible for 30 million deaths. Only in Iran, over sanctions, over 1 million deaths of children due to lack of access to medicine. So this we have to contend. So I don't know what the answer is, but the answer will have to be that they will essentially lose the ability to continue to fight with others. And then they need a smart leader who, without losing face, is able to prepare Americans. And in a way, I see the current incumbent in the White House as representing the dying throes of the empire gasping for air, trying to remind everybody we are still here. But a large portion of the responsibility lies with the average American, who I've also suggested is a beneficiary of American hegemony, but is reluctant to accept it while sheepishly arguing that they oppose the government. The current incumbent was not elected by 5 million people, as you know. He was elected by over close to 19 million. And when it comes to wars with other countries and demonizing others, there is both parties are aligned, because Americans have been accustomed to normalizing the pain and destruction that they cause to others. So it'll take time, a consciousness, a new leader, and a consciousness among Americans too. You know, I'll finish by saying that when on the first 2 days the Americans and Israelis killed 160 children in Iran, as you all know, which is illegal, it's a war crime, there was no outrage. But imagine if 150 killed children were killed somewhere in the United States or Europe, we would still be hearing about it. As you are nodding your head, we would still be hearing about it. And nobody wants to see children of any country, any race killed. But it does show us how duplicitous and immoral the society itself has become. And that society has to wake up. But because we gave it so much power over the last 70, 80 years, we are now having to weather its decline. And that pain will only be shortened if they can elect a good leader. And they've so far not been able to, because the system is quite corrupt. Not quite, very corrupt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have this one question from Niranjan Pant. One, would you say that the Chinese system is much more citizen participative, albeit with party oversight, than the dubious liberal democracy in the Indo-West? And his second question is, regardless of the brazenness of US-Israeli attack on Iran, what is your opinion about the fundamentalist brutality of Iranian regime and their covert involvement with Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, who make no secret of their Islamist brutality? Question from Niranjan Pant. Chandran, please.
I think to the first question, I would agree that the Chinese system, in a very different way, is more citizen participation. It's communitarian, so the community is brought into it, but the system also believes that the collective welfare is more important than the individual rights. So dissent is not tolerated, and because it gets in the way of collective. You know, to give an example, if they want to build a railway of 500 kilometers, and it has to go this way, and they do all the economics, and it requires moving 2-3 villages of 5,000 people each, no one is allowed to protest. It will be done because the calculus is very clear. 10 million people will benefit from this. This will increase all of this, increase trade, welfare, and all of those things. So for the interest of 10 million, we will not listen to a handful of other people, but we will compensate them, etc. So it's very, and then they buy in everybody else. So it's communitarian, but it is intolerant of disruption giving the individual a disproportionate right to disrupt the collective welfare. In terms of the discussion about Iran, etc., I've been to Iran 5, 6 times, and it's an amazing place. I'm sure most Indians know the history, the civilization. It's a very learned place. And I do agree. I have friends who are doctors, engineers, etc., who said we don't agree with the government, etc. But if we are attacked by others, we will defend our nation, even though we are doctors, etc. I would take with a pinch of salt. And I have no doubt that there are excesses in terms of how the system works, etc. But let us also be very clear why the system is the way it is. The Europeans and the Americans have imposed harsh sanctions on this country for 30, 40 years, brutally trying to squeeze the life out of it with everything. So the nationalists, the most hardcore people who believe in their civilizational right to defend the civilization, becomes the one in power. And then they are more squeezed, they become harder, become hard-nosed, and then they become what they are. But I would take with a pinch of salt the idea that in the recent protests, the numbers killed were that high. My Iranian friends, some of them say that's not true. And I know from a fact, having myself lived in Hong Kong during the riots in Hong Kong, how it is reported in the foreign media, etc. That these and we all don't need to be told how the Western media essentially lies or distorts most of that. Having said that, I am not saying that the government, the government of Iran, is good and should stay, etc. But I do feel that it is up to the Iranians to change it, and it's not up to the others. In terms of the proxy wars, etc., we can carry on talking about that a long time in another discussion. But Iran is the only nation in the Middle East, despite being Shia, who have stood up for the Palestinians. And in that way, they have great respect in many parts. So that too is a complex set of issues, but Iran has stood up for them, and therefore they have been seen to be supporting the proxy war using these other agents. But so have the Americans and everybody else. So I'm not making any excuses, but I think it's much more complex than we believe how it is portrayed in the Western media.
I will request Comrade Bhargav to take up the question from the chat box. Comrade Bhargav.
Yeah, thank you, Subhash. Thank you very much, Chandranji, for this incisive analysis and very thought-provoking presentation. And I take one question from chat box. It is from on Minugundevia. She's asking, thank you for your incisive and lucid analysis. But I would like to know your view on issues around China-Taiwan relationship.
Oh, China, Taiwan, okay. The China-Taiwan issue, in my view, is only blown up every time the Americans and Europeans want to blow it up. As far as the Chinese are concerned, things just go on. Taiwanese investments in China are huge. The idea that China, the laughable sort of continuous discussions in the Western media that China is going to invade Taiwan is so laughable. Taiwan is so small that China could walk across the ocean. And if it wanted to harm Taiwan, it would take a day, and it wouldn't have to send troops. So I think this is again a Western creation, and then circulated around the world as though it's the biggest issue. As the Chinese do overreact, and I've said this, overreact, but they do need to appeal to a domestic audience too, like all political leaders have. But there's no way China will attack Taiwan. I mean, I think people don't understand. The Chinese will not spill the blood of other Chinese, not Taiwanese. So Taiwanese, I don't think are afraid of this. but only foreigners, particularly Western media, continue to spread this lie. And every time something happens in another part of the world, oh yeah, I remember this. When the U.S. attacked Iran, rather than condemning the U.S., the Western media went on saying, "Oh my God, now this will embolden China to attack Taiwan." Fairy tales. So I think the relationship is fine until some Western politician, American, tries to get headlines and speaks about it. Otherwise, business as usual.
Okay. So, thank you. And there is one more question propped up there. It is from Harita. Are we moving towards a multipolar world or just a different kind of bipolarity between the US and China? What is the role India can play in this context? First question. Second, is the India China dynamics fundamentally competitive, or is there a possibility of these two civilizational states coming together for global South leadership? However improbable it looks right now.
Thank you. Very good question. I'll try and answer it quickly. The first thing I want to say is I wanted to say it earlier when I think someone mentioned, I think Ravi, you mentioned the conflict between China and India. China and India. No, China and USA. Sorry, the conflict between China and USA. And I wrote a piece and I also spoke about this recently when I said a conflict suggests two nations are fighting each other. There is no China trying to fight the United States. It's the United States trying to control China and contain it. They've said it openly. China is not trying to fight with the United States. China has openly said, we do not want to be number one. So I think the language is important. There is no US-China conflict. There is a US trying to have a conflict with China. China is not seeking a conflict with the United States. And despite all the provocation, the Chinese have behaved with great calm and restraint. Even though there might be, certain times where they have also wanted to not seem to be passive. But I think it's important we understand China is not fighting the United States. The United States is trying to contain. Then to your other point about China, India, I have said this before, and this is kind of bold. My belief is that the United States will continue to be an irritant and a rogue state for a while. And I think great nations like India need to disconnect from that subservient relationship and looking to the USA as an ally, etc. I think India is too important, too big, has too much going for itself, that it needs to essentially shake hands with the rogue state, and thereby sending geopolitical signals that I don't think are in the interest of the respect India deserves, and also not good for the world. Dare I say that Prime Minister Modi's visit to go to Israel a few days before they attacked Iran and do a bear hug, I think sent shockwaves around the world to those of us who see India as a great nation that is non-aligned, stands for the majority of us, one of the biggest countries, and couldn't see why on earth the leader of India would see it necessary to go and shake hands with a man who's already been charged with war crimes and a arrest warrant has been issued. So this is, I think, signaling that's confusing the world, especially because it is India. So to your point, I'll say that the world has to deal with the United States rogue behavior. How long it'll go on depends on whether the United States will get a good leader. We don't know, but maybe miracles will happen. But what is clear to me, and I say this, the most consequential relationship of the 21st century, in my view, will be China-India. Who cares about what happens in Europe? And until the United States weans itself of its white supremacist attitude and gets a good leader, We will all have to contend with it. China, India, Africa, etc. So we should not be looking to appease the rogue. We should be looking to sort of ignore, don't pick a fight, but find our own. And which are the two most important nations? I think it's China and India. I have said this when I was in Delhi last year. I said that the most consequential relationship, in my view, for the 21st century is China and India. 3 billion people, 1/3 of humanity. And I think you all as Indians will understand. And this too, I think, requires new thinking. China and India comes together, immediately things start to change in Pakistan. Immediately things start to change in Bangladesh. And looking at 2050, that's a population of 500 million people between Bangladesh and Pakistan. That's a game changer. And that changes everything. Asia will be prosperous. And we start to redefine what multipolar means. We start to redefine the course of history for the next 100 years or so. So I don't think it's an impossibility. And I think there's a great possibility. But the environment in India, if I could say this, seems to be very anti-China, especially when you watch TV. And I think it doesn't have to be pro-China, but I think it needs to understand China. So maybe someone can publish my book in Hindi and all the other dialects, and also in English and distribute it. But it needs to understand China, because China and India together will change the course of human history for the next 200-300 years. And this requires a very different way of thinking. And I do think that, we do not want the next generation of young Indians to see China as a bad country, and then to see Pakistan as an enemy. We want a different world. And the Americans are not going to make that work for us, nor the Europeans. They don't even understand. So I would say, yes, China, India will change the world if they can come to, and let's face it, China and India have not gone and fought terrible wars. So I think there's great wisdom on both sides. Now they just have to come together and change the world.
Now I request Urmi to raise her question.
Thank you very much. I just had a very quick question. I was wondering whether there are other examples of nations that have been to some extent inspired by the Chinese model for uplifting people out of poverty, or are there other nations that could possibly be inspired? I mean, in which sense is this model transferable?
I think, as I argue in my book, the Chinese model itself cannot be transferred as such, right? Because it's rooted in civilization, culture. It's a very different culture. But I think the political emphasis on communitarian objectives and long-term planning is being studied very closely by many countries. As I said, even 10 years ago, the propaganda was such that nobody wanted to give any credit to China. Today it's very different. You go anywhere and they say, man, how do the Chinese do that? Wherever I go, how did they do that? How did they do this? How did they do that? I do my little bit from my little insights to share what the core pillars are. And that's why I also tried to write that book. So the Chinese model itself is not transferable, and the Chinese are the first to say you can't copy us, but you can take some of the key principles, and some of the key principles are, as I said in the book, investing in the right things, communitarian, the people, but most importantly, and this is difficult, is having competent people in government and intolerance for mediocrity in the service of the people, right? And that has been the system. And I know, well, the Singapore system is very small, but that's the system. It's about competence, intolerance for all of that. I would say that the Vietnamese system is a bit like that. It's got the same way of doing things, and Other countries in Africa, you could say Rwanda, etc., are trying. But you'll see all of these countries will never get a good thing said about themselves in the Western media because they are not following that tradition. But all I can say is wherever I go now, there are lots of questions about how do they do it, and I think that's really needs to be understood. But it cannot be transplanted, you know. But you have to take the good bits. But the core is very, very, very competent people in the right places. A huge emphasis on meritocracy in the public and private sector, and an intolerance for sort of bad behavior that jeopardizes the social contract and harmony. It's that, and you can sense that. I was just speaking to a friend of mine the other day. Every time I go to China, and when I go to the big cities, the more and more I go, I find even in a large city like Beijing or Shanghai, I feel like I'm in a very small neighborhood, but there's 20 million there, and they've constantly continued to improve every little element that you can be in parts of Shanghai and you feel like you're in a small neighborhood. There isn't much noise. You know, these are funny things. The cleanliness is off the charts. I was in Shanghai and Beijing. You won't find a piece of paper. The landscaping is award-winning. Every square inch of somewhere, they've planted things. There's recreation spaces everywhere. So it's a constant sort of attention to detail, and accountability is the other big thing. You cannot half finish anything. And one of the things I said to my friend in India was, when I went back this time, I said, my God, everything seems to be half finished, even the road improvement. And we joked about it because there isn't an accountability, right? And I think those are the differences.
Abdul Bukadir had raised his hand. I request him to unmute himself and Mr. Abdul Muqdir. Who is not able
Okay,
to unmute.
can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can.
Okay. My question, sir, is that how can the Chinese model of the China, which is mostly a homogeneous country, people, homogeneous people, be applied to the three countries of the Indian subcontinent when we see the diversity of people within these three countries?
As I said, I think it's difficult. I mean, China is homogeneous in the sense that it also created a sort of homogeneous modern culture by, you know, making Putonghua, Mandarin, the language across the education system, etc. But it's also very diverse in the amount of minority groups. Maybe not as diverse as India, but as you know, there are about 55 or 56 minority groups in China. It's extremely rich and diverse as well, but it has that sort of homogeneous Chinese civilizational glue that has kept it together in that way. But it's also been politically constructed to ensure that diversity is not woven in a way that it makes it strong. So in the Indian context, in the subcontinent, I assume you're referring to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And I don't know how you can't bring that same system because the political history is so different too, and you've already embraced the so-called notion of democracy and liberal democracies. Maybe the closest version is Pakistan, which is a military state, but maybe it needs enlightened leaders like the Chinese leaders who are committed to the community rather than enriching themselves. That is not to say there's no corruption in the Chinese system. As I said, President Xi saw massive corruption as a threat to the foundations of the state when he came in 30, more than 12 years ago, and carried out a massive anti-corruption campaign, and to this day continues to do that. In fact, only a few months ago, the Minister for Agriculture was prosecuted, and I think he suffered capital punishment, if I'm not mistaken. So it continues to be the case. But you need people who are committed in that way and take a long-term view. So I don't know, Pakistan has got a military sort of state structure, if I can call it that, but then it doesn't have the institutions. One thing strong, whichever system, the institutions have to be very strong. And I don't know if you would agree that maybe, the institutions of the state at the state level in India, are they strong? I just give you an example. I can go to a small town in China, which like India would typically be, 2 to 3 million people. It'd be a small town, and we would run projects, and we would meet the mayor, and the mayor would be a 40-year-old woman with a PhD in economics and a first degree in linguistics, and the deputy mayor would be a 38-year-old engineer with a PhD in chemical engineering and a master's in economics. No fools. And they work 24/7. They all have KPIs as though they work for a big company, and they're 100% committed to the community. And that's how they are measured, that's how they're promoted, and if they don't perform, they're out. And that's the system down to the townships. So it's a very, very demanding, but a system that demands you to work for the party which is dedicated to the people, and within which, of course, there are abuses, etc. But the system at the moment seeks to eradicate it.
Mr.
You need a
Chandran,
tough leader for that. Sorry.
it's okay. If you have not yet completed, please, I'm sorry for interjecting. You can complete what
No,
you're
I
saying.
completed.
Okay, thank you. I just I have one question from my side. Compared to India and China, one, of course, most important aspect that you have already elaborated in a beautiful way, that the governance, the stark difference between the way the countries are governed in China and India. But on a historical scale, long-term scale, if India also has to invent its own version of modernity in society, not in technological economic sense, in society has to be modernized. If India also has to embark on a steady path of social modernization, the most important stumbling block seems to be the traditional communities which have a vicious chokehold on individual autonomy, traditionally speaking. So any modernity cannot be imagined without some kind of release of individual from the traditional community chokehold. So it will also come into conflict with the running the country to greater heights, collective welfare, vis-a-vis individual rights. So collective rights have to be promoted or put on the primary seat. So how this will this contradiction seems to be, because if a society has to modernize, individual has to be given autonomy and say, expression and all that. But at the same time, how to curb that, how to stop that from degenerating into excessive individualism at the cost of community. But in Indian case, to cut short, communities largely are negative, even though there are positive things of providing security, etc., etc. But largely remain, for example, caste is the best example. They are detrimental to the growth and expression of individuals. So how do we tackle this dilemma?
I wish I knew, but I think I wish I knew, but I would say that it is actually a very interesting dilemma. There is an argument, and I was with a lecturer of anthropology, Chinese, just last week, and she teaches religious religion and the state in China. She's Chinese. And what she's trying to explain to the Chinese and build a body of work and scholarship around this is why the Chinese state is tolerant of your religious beliefs, but not of, and I think I'm saying it correctly, but not of you bringing religion into the social space. Because for the very reasons you just mentioned, then people use their religious beliefs as a license to not behave in the interest of the collective as well, right? So that was a revolution in China. And I think China took a lot of criticism for that. But what people don't understand is lots of Chinese people go to temples. They go to, there's a large Muslim community, as you all know. And I can send you pictures of the breaking of fast in large Chinese cities where there are tens of thousands of Muslims all gathered together. So they're large communities. And these are all tolerated, but you cannot bring politics into it and disrupt the social order around which there are very clear rules. And so I think this for me was also good to talk to her to understand how the Chinese system does. I have very good Tibetan friends, and in the last 10, 15 years, we all know the history, and there's many different interpretations of all of that. But in the last 15 years, and I go to a very remote monastery town. It's recognized as the second or third most sacred Tibetan monastery in the Tibetan world, and it's in China. And I go there. I have very close friends, and the monasteries are funded enormously by the government to be completely refurbished. The sanitation, which is typically not good in the places of worship, have been made world-class with sewers and all the facilities provided. And then I noticed that they're all allowed to practice, but don't bring politics. So that's kind of where I think the Chinese system says, you can do what you want, but we will not tolerate any expressions of your individual beliefs that create social disharmony. And that's the social contract. And over time, I think the majority of Chinese have bought into it, as have, and I'm sure there's some people who disagree with somewhat a bit of what I'm saying, as have done most of the Chinese, the Tibetans and Muslims. That there's great freedom, but you cannot politicize it. So many of the Tibetan monasteries are well funded by Han Chinese who believe in the Buddhist traditions. And another thing I'll say to you is also, when I go and I say because I'm vegetarian, when I go to China and I go and they say they give me meat and I say I don't eat meat, and then I say I'm a Hindu, born as a Hindu, and I don't eat meat, immediately they will go like this. The respect for Hinduism, Indians, is huge. They say Hindu Ren, and then they will bow because they understand the connections. It's very interesting. So this is why my hope that the China-India partnership will be the most consequential. But to your question, sir, I would say the Indian government, that's the most tricky thing that the Indian government any Indian government will have to do, which is to curb that expression of deep beliefs which in the public domain can disrupt the social order and hinder collective progress. And that is a tough one to do. But it becomes very difficult if the leading politicians themselves are religious activists. And the Chinese leaders are not religious activists. They're the complete opposite. So there you go, if you know what I mean. And I agree with you. There can be little progress without that. But you can use other proxy means to curb that because you are developing people's well-being. You see what I mean? You can say you can't do it, but if you give people housing, this and that, then people become, your point about modernization, which is not giving up our culture, but allowing you to improve the quality of your life and therefore the next generations without letting your beliefs hinder yourself and the society at large. And we've seen this in many parts of the world. So I'm not one for saying that we should modernize, which is the equivalent of becoming westernized. But we should modernize in the way that allows people to break free of the drudgery of the lives and the beliefs that hinder them. And I think there are other ways to do it. Political means, but you have to show that you can improve quality of life. And I think on that, the delivery mechanism of the Chinese government in the most remote places I've gone has really not 100% bought the, won over the communities that even still have some resentments, of course. But the delivery of the infrastructure, places where there was no heating ever, getting heating, water, toilets, roads, trains, then people think, hey, I can trade off some restrictions on maybe my belief because the upside is so vast. I think this is good for us. I think that's the trick. You have to bundle it together. You have to provide development goods.
I will request Professor Ramurthy Sharma to unmute himself and raise his question. He has placed a question in the chat box. Professor Ramurthy Sharma, please.
So I have, sir, three very brief questions which are joined together. One is that what is the resource distribution scale in China as comparison to India, wherein 1% is having one topmost rich people are having 40% resource. What is the state in China? And second is, at whose cost China has developed its economic prosperity? I mean, in terms of international exploitation of the countries such as Taiwan, Tibet, and so on and so forth. Will you not consider China as equally imperialistic as in case we can refer it in context of USA also? And third is that looking at the close connectivity between Communist Party of China and RSS to some extent, as per certain reports, India is not also leading towards heading towards one party system while diminishing all the other political party one by one or other way, directly or indirectly. Yes.
So maybe I'll start with the last question. I think the Indian one-party attempt. I think most of the Indians will probably recognize this is not going to sustain itself. But more importantly, the one-party attempts, if I can call it that, are also, unlike China, are driven by narrow political and religious beliefs, which is not the same in China. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and I'm not here to be a flag bearer or anything like that, is driven by very different. It's not religious. It is revolutionary in its creation. It was an anti-colonial party, and then it has committed itself to communitarian socialist principles. I think that's the difference. You could say that the United States is also going through an attempt in a so-called democracy to create a one-party state. There's even today I just read a piece saying that the current president will find a way maybe to even cancel the midterm elections under the pretext of a danger to the economy, no danger to the country, security, and therefore maybe even argue. And this is serious people writing about this, about extending his term. So I think, but these are very different from the motivations are very different. So that will be the point I say. To the second question, the first question was about, I believe. Can you remind me the first question?
Yes, sir. It's about the distribution of resources at individual level. For example, there are reports which suggest that in India, topmost 1%
Oh
rich.
yes. Yeah, I don't know the data in China, but what I can tell you, it's well understood in China, if you're rich and you behave like some of the most wealthy in India, I won't mention names, and you have,
Yeah.
and you, and you have celebrations that last 3 weeks, and you fly in
Yeah.
all the friends from around the world, you will get a call from the government, and your party will your celebrations will need to be reduced.
Okay.
So excessive wealth display and opulence and showing it off is looked down upon. And when wealthy people have attempted to interfere in ways that both create a bad example, etc., there have been very clear actions by the government. But in terms of the numbers, I don't know exactly what proportion. It would actually be interesting to find out, but I think it will be less than that is there is in India. And I think your second question was related to. Can you remind me?
Yeah, surely, sir. It's about the cost of economic
Oh yeah,
prosperity,
yeah. Who
even
is
in
paid for it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think there are very few countries that would say that China has exploited it. I think there are countries that would say that the Chinese presence has created impacts that they don't like, or where they have felt that it has affected markets, etc. But I don't think any country will say they came and exploited us in this way. So I think you mentioned, has China's development been at the expense of Taiwan? If
Yeah,
anything,
or
if anything, Taiwan's development has been in partnership with China. Many of the tech companies in Taiwan are all invested heavily in China. So if China wanted to really have a negative impact on Taiwan, there are many economic ways it could do it. So there's no, in fact, that has been the glue that people don't quite understand fully, is that China and Taiwan have very close economic relations.
That was the last question, with according to Chandran. So we need to conclude now.
Yes.
Or are you ready to take one more question, Chandran?
Sure,
One
sure.
last
One more
question.
thing. Yes,
One.
sure.
Subrat, please unmute yourself and share your question. Subrat.
Okay, actually, I had two questions, if I may. One is the first one was coming from the angle of the view that China has hegemonic ambitions. There was this Sri Lankan crisis, this Hambantota port, and maybe I could be wrong here and there, but I would like to hear your perspective of the
please
Sri
come.
Lankan crisis and the Chinese role that they have supposed to have played in it. And in that connection, whether India's refusal to connect the Belt and Road Initiative, was it wrong? Was it right? I mean, did it adversely affect India, or maybe it was correct? And the second thing was second question is, I know it's a very detailed question. It may not be so easy. I mean, but it's a curiosity question. You said that the Chinese government they make sure that the mediocrity and inefficiency is rooted out at any level. But how did they, historically speaking, since 1990s when they started um, at this upward growth path, how did they themselves take care that the people who judged mediocrity and inefficiency, they themselves were not mediocre or inefficient? I mean, how did they take care of that possibility? That was also possible, is it not?
Yes, yes, very good. So maybe I'll start with the second question first. You don't get to be, so the people who do that would be at every level, and there are five tiers at which the Chinese system works, from the village to the township, to the cities, the municipalities, and the province, and then the central government. And at each level, people are placed in and get to those positions through a rigorous process of selection and performance. So even if you look at any governor of any province in China, he or she would have 25 to 30 years of having worked their way up. So you don't get Barack Obama's, you don't get uh, the current incumbent, you don't get people without experience in the most hardship places. The current president, President Xi, his life story is very clear. Came from a privileged family. Then, through the Cultural Revolution, his father was banished, and then he worked himself up. And I think he worked at the provincial level with results. 30 years or 25 years, really working themselves up. So they are the cream. You get there, and then they appoint only the very best because they've been schooled in that, and they are accountable for all of that. So that's how they do that. And then, I remember in my early days when I went, you go to villages and you'd see all these old party guys smoking cigarettes. They were party loyalists, but
Okay.
you would be hard pressed to say that they were, you know, suited to the modern needs of rebuilding the nation. And I said today you'd go and find 35, 40-year-olds with double degrees speak English, and they are the most competent. And to get to those positions, the other interesting thing is it's seen as a badge of honor to be selected to go and serve the people in those places. And these are the cream of China who get involved. So, in many places you often say that the best people work for the private sector and then the not so good work in government. I would say in China it's both. There are people who want to serve, and there's a complicated system through the party, etc. And it's not everybody will agree to how it brings in these people, it co-opts them to serve the people, etc. So that's how it is. Now, to your point about hegemonic ambitions, I think inadvertently, and this is what I said before, China can have hegemonic impacts, but
Yes, you said
yeah,
that.
you can
Yes.
have that, and I'm the first to say you've got to be very careful because it's so big, and particularly in the quest for markets and resources. But in terms of hegemonic interest to control things for its self-interest, I don't think this is the case. Now, this is very difficult when I speak to Western audiences to understand, because in a way, if your last 500 years has always been about extraction, exploitation, and suppression of the people, you see everything through the lights of your political experience and how you understand the world. And this is why sometimes I argue that the West is so afraid of the rise of China and other countries becoming powerful, because at some level they think we will do to them what they did to us. And
Yeah.
I think this is difficult for them to understand because everything is about power, and the Americans embody that attitude in the worst possible way, even liberals. So I think it doesn't have hegemonic ambitions, but it can have hegemonic impacts through carelessness and inadvertently, putting its feet where it shouldn't be. Now, when it comes to the Sri Lankan thing, again, as I said, there's a lot of documentation that these were not deliberate traps. If there was, it was inadvertent. But also when it comes to then comparing it with the debts imposed on nations by the IMF, the World Bank, they pale in comparison. The world's best economists have all shown this. So again, this is propaganda. And I had I run some of these not podcasts, some of these virtual conferences, which I welcome everyone to go to our website. We run this for the Foreign Ministry Commissioner's Office in Hong Kong to explain, and we bring speakers from all over the world. And next time we run one, Ravi and Subhash, I would like to get in touch with you to get some of your people. And we've had some of the top economists from Africa, etc., explain that these exaggerations are unreal, and they don't compare to the debt that poor countries have with the World Bank, the IMF, and all of those as well. So, and should India have become said yes to the One Belt, One Road? I think absolutely. I think it was a good message for the world, and I think it would have helped India and China to start laying the foundations for what I believe is the most consequential partnership for the world. I think India could have helped, China could have helped India a great deal. I think India could have also helped China in other ways. But for whatever reason, and I think it comes back to the earlier point I made, the messaging from India is these people, we don't want to partner with them, but we will partner with the Americans. I think the time has come for India to understand that the world has changed, and it doesn't have to show its subservience. Maybe subservience is a strong word, but it's allegiance to the West as opposed to others in Asia, especially China. China is not a threat in my view.
But during last 1 year, as we see, it is subservience. I think the subservience is the correct word in the context of last 1 year.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So, thank you, Chandran, for this exciting presentation and the manner in which you are telling the global majority to look at the world and geopolitics in a very new light. How we need to see the way you try to expose the hypocrisy of the Western world, and with the way you try to put forward that we should need to put the collective welfare before individuals. All those things, they're really thought-provoking, and I'm sure our listeners would like to listen to you once more after some time. Thank you very much for everyone to join in this.
Yeah, can I just
Please,
say
please.
one thing? When I was talking to some Chinese officials about, they were saying, what can we do with India? And I said, you can do two things. The first one I said is that China should put forth the proposal for India to become a permanent member of the Security Council, basically propose a P7 made up of India and Africa. Right? I think that would be a game changer. And the second thing I said is that every year the Chinese should host a cricket match in Tiananmen Square. They will put out the turf in Tiananmen Square, and they will get a World 11 made up of all the best from around the world, with maybe 2 Chinese players playing the Indian team. And I said all they needed was then for the Indian captain to say, China is great and everything will be okay. And then we will start. So I said to them, you all don't understand cricket. So you must host a cricket game in Tiananmen Square, put a nice turf, the whole world will watch, and the Indian captain just needs to say, China and India, come on, let's be friends and everything will be okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chandran. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.